This chapter is about how different countries link together and connected with each other. It's a journey from different nations to a whole global world. Basically, it's about how different people from different countries came close to each other and how the world shrank. So as you know that this chapter contains four main parts. So now let's start with the first part, that is the pre-modern world. If we talk about globalization, we normally think of the economic system. But this global world has evolved from many other things such as trade, search of work, capital, and many other things. From ancient times only, travelers and traders they moved from one place to another in search of work, in search of knowledge. They brought their culture with them and carried the same things. That's how the world started to connect. Silk routes is a very good example of this link as it linked Asia with Africa and Europe. Silk, pottery, textile, and many other things were exchanged from these routes. Even we can trace this interconnection of pre-modern world in food, as many crops came to Europe only after Christopher Columbus discovered America. So this was about how pre-modern world was linked. Now this pre-modern world shrank greatly in 16th century as European founded sea routes to Asia and America. America was cut off from all this world, but in 16th century it again rose to importance. As Europeans grew in power, they started to conquer more area. For example, Spanish conquerors tried to conquer America, but their main weapon was not military but smallpox germs. Until 19th century in Europe, poverty, hunger, religious conflicts were common. Until 18th century, India and China were among the richest countries. In 15th century, when China restricted its trade, the center of trade moved westward and Europe became center. So this was about the first part. Now let's move to the second part, that is the 19th century. World changed greatly in 19th century. Economists identified three major flow of goods, flow of labor and movement of capital. So coming to globalization, let's start with Europe. In Europe in 19th century, population grew dramatically. That's why food prices rose. At the very same time, government made corn laws. It was abolition of import of corn. So unhappy with high food prices, people demanded abolition of this law. So government was forced to abolish this. After the abolition of this law, food was cheaply imported and food prices fell and consumption rose. And to fulfill this demand of Britain, all over the world land was cleared and many other things were needed such as labor and capital. So capital flew from Europe and labor were migrated to America and Australia. In India also many such changes were observed. World trade multiplied 25 to 40 times between 1820 to 1940. In 19th century, technology also grew as railways, ships, telegraphs were important invention. For example, frozen meat was transported so that poor can afford it. At the same time, trade flourished, but there was a problem that people lost their freedom as Europeans started to conquer whole world. Britain and France made large extension to their overseas territories. In Africa also, European people were attracted due to its vast land and minerals. They wanted to start mines and plantations there, but there was a problem that there was shortage of labor. So to recruit laborers, employer used many methods. Then in 1880, rinderpest came and killed 90% of cattle. African people lost their livelihoods and were forced to work for wages. That's how Europeans conquered Africa. The three flows of global world were also seen in India. First, labor. In 19th century, indentured labor were hired from India to work in other countries. They migrated there in search of good working and living conditions. But when they reached there, they got to know that the conditions there were severe. But then also they adjusted there. Some of them permanently settled there and some of them returned. So the second was capital. Indian bankers such as Shikaripuri Shroff and Natukotai Chettiar, they financed export agriculture. Some Indian traders established flourishing exportia at busy ports in 1960s. Third was trade. In 19th century, Indian exports of manufactured products declined as they were facing stiff competitions with British manufacturers. But at the same time, Indian exports of raw material rose as raw cotton, opium, indigo were exported from India. In 19th century, Indian exports expanded, But there was a problem that British imports in India were more than Indian exports. This led to a trade surplus for Britishers. They used this surplus to balance their trade deficit with other countries. That's how the world economy worked in 19th century. So now let's move to the third part, that is the interwar economy. Between 1914 to 1918, First World War happened. This was the first modern war. It led the whole world to crisis. The main effect was on Britain as it borrowed a lot of sum from US. US turned from an international debtor to an international creditor. It was difficult for Europe to have post-war recovery. Europe lost its dominance over the world market. At the same time, Europe got economic boom, large increase in production, employment, demand. But when this boom ended, there was contraction in production and unemployment rose. Europe was under great economic depression. In US also the impact was seen, but there the recovery was quicker. The main cause of this was mass production. People started to mass produce things. This led to higher wages and reduced cost of products. The main cause of their recovery was mass production and mass consumption. US became the largest overseas lender in 1923. Everything was going good, but there came the Great Depression, which shook the whole world. World experienced decline in production, trade, incomes. The main two factors of this depression were first, the agriculture overproduction. Second, in 1920s, many countries borrowed money from US, but in fear of depression, many people withdrew their money, which led to acute crisis. This depression also hit US hard. In US also households and harvests were ruined. Banking system and businesses collapsed. In 1935 the world was recovering from this depression, but the recovery was very hard. This depression also had severe impacts on India. Imports and exports halved, prices fell, peasants suffered, their indebtedness increased, government refused to reduce revenues, and India also became exporter of precious metals. So overall, there was a great impact of this depression to all over the world. Now let's move to the fourth part, that is rebuilding a world economy in the post-war era. The Second World War broke in 1839. This war caused economic devastation and social disruption. The main two events in the post-war reconstruction were first, US emergence as dominant political, economical and military power, and second was Soviet Union became world power. Economists and politicians drew two key lessons from these economic experiences. First, that mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption, and for mass consumption, there should be stable income. Second, that the goal of stable income can only be achieved if government had the power to control the flow of goods, capital and labor. So to solve these problems, in 1944 in Bretton Woods Conference, International Monetary Fund and World Bank were established. These linked international currencies and monetary systems with each other. This system gave very good results. World saw growth in trade and incomes. Unemployment decreased and there was spread of technology. With all this economical development, there came independence. The countries which were under colonial rule became independent, but they were facing poverty and lack of resources. So the Bretton Woods institutions shifted their attention towards less developed countries. Because of this, the countries, even though they were independent, they were controlled by colonial powers. So to solve this problem, developing countries organized themselves into a group of 77, and demanded new economic orders. There was stabilization in economic system, but all was not good. In 1960s, US finances was weakened. There were debt crises in developing countries and MNCs shifted their attention to low wages countries. In the last 2 decades, world's economic geography has changed a lot as the countries like India, China and Brazil had undergone rapid economic transformation. So here the chapter ends and I hope that you all like this video. Thank you.